The rotors beat at 289 cycles per minute, and the sand came up to meet them in a wall of brown-white nothing. 8A, AH-64 Apaches and 4 MH-53J Pave Lows held formation at 50 feet above the desert floor, running without lights across the Iraqi border at 0238 hours on January 17, 1991. The air tasted like chalk and JP4 exhaust. Ground temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, but the cockpits ran hot from avionics heat, and the pilot's neck muscles burned under the weight of night vision goggles that turned the world into a green-black tunnel. Somewhere ahead, 22 minutes ahead at current airspeed, 2 Iraqi early warning radar stations sat in the dark, their Soviet-built P-15 flat-face arrays scanning the southern horizon. Those stations covered a gap in Iraq's Kari integrated air defense network. If they stayed operational past 0300 hours, the opening wave of Operation Desert Storm would fly into a wall of surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided anti-aircraft fire. The entire air campaign hinged on 2 clusters of buildings in the desert that most Air Force generals couldn't have located on a map 6 months earlier. The after-action report for Task Force Normandy stayed classified for years. When pieces of it finally surfaced through declassification requests and unit histories in the mid-1990s, military analysts found an operation that broke almost every assumption about how the AH-64 Apache would perform in combat. The helicopter that critics had spent a decade calling too fragile and too complex for sustained operations had just executed the most precisely timed opening strike in modern air warfare history. At night, in degraded visual conditions, after flying 90 minutes deep into enemy territory. The 101st Airborne Division's official history records that the task force achieved 100% destruction of both radar sites within 4.5 minutes of opening fire. Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody, commanding the Apache element, later told Army Aviation magazine that when his flight reached the initial point, the FLIR picture was so good I could count the guy wires on the antenna. Sensor performance like that from a helicopter the Army had nearly canceled twice left Pentagon observers split on whether it counted as vindication or a fluke. The broader military barely knew the mission had happened. Task Force Normandy operated under such tight operational security that the Air Force pilots waiting at their bases in Saudi Arabia only learned the radar gap was open when they received their go codes. No preliminary briefing mentioned helicopters. The plan called for absolute radio silence from the Apache crews until weapons impact, at which point Cody would transmit a single code word to confirm the sites were down. If the Apaches failed, if even one radar installation survived and alerted Baghdad, the coalition would have to choose between sending hundreds of aircraft into active air defenses or scrubbing the most complex air tasking order ever written. There was no backup plan because Lieutenant General Charles Horner, the Joint Force Air Component Commander, had decided there didn't need to be one. He had reviewed the Apache's targeting systems and Cody's rehearsal results from weeks of training at King Fahd International Airport, then made a judgment that would have ended careers if it went wrong. Horner's deputy, Brigadier General Buster Glosson, was more blunt about the stakes. In Rick Atkinson's Crusade, Glosson recalled the planning sessions with a single observation about what failure would mean for the air campaign's opening night. We'd have had dead people all over southern Iraq. How does a helicopter that nearly died on the floor of Congress end up opening the largest air campaign since World War II? The answer stretches back to 1972, when the Army issued its Advanced Attack Helicopter requirement, a specification born from watching Tau missile-equipped AH-1 Cobras struggle against simulated Soviet armor formations during NATO exercises in West Germany. The Cobra was a Vietnam-era gunship, fast, agile, good at chewing up tree lines and supply trucks. But the Army's projections for a European ground war showed thousands of Warsaw-packed tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap. And the Cobra didn't carry enough ordnance or have the sensors to fight at night or in bad weather. The AAH program wanted something fundamentally different, a helicopter that could kill tanks in the dark, in rain, in snow, while surviving hits from 23mm anti-aircraft fire. Two companies submitted prototypes. Bell offered the AH-63, a conventional design that shared components with its proven UH-1 lineage. Hughes Helicopters offered the AH-64, an angular, aggressive-looking machine with a tandem cockpit, a chain gun slung under its chin, and a targeting system so ambitious that engineers at Martin Marietta were still writing software for it when the first airframe flew. The Army picked Hughes in December 1976. Bell protested. Congress held hearings. The General Accounting Office began what would become a decade-long adversarial relationship with the program, and the budget started climbing. Hughes had estimated a unit cost of roughly $7 million in 1972 dollars. By the time the first production AH-64A rolled off the line in January 1984, the price tag had swollen past $14 million per copy, and that was before spare parts, training systems, and the maintenance infrastructure the helicopter demanded. A 1982 GAO report to Congress noted that the Apache required an estimated 4.4 maintenance hours for every hour of flight time, compared to 2.1 for the Cobra it was replacing. The report's language was measured and bureaucratic. It was also devastating. It questioned whether the Army could sustain Apache operations at the tempo a European war would require. The maintenance numbers became a weapon for critics. Senator Sam Nunn, who chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee and generally supported Army aviation, nonetheless pressed hard during appropriations hearings on whether the Apache's complexity made it a liability. The helicopter's Target Acquisition Designation Site and Pilot Night Vision Sensor, the TADS/PNVS system that gave it night fighting capability, contained optics so sensitive that field maintenance crews needed clean room conditions to service them. In the field, where clean rooms don't exist, a 1986 Department of Defense Operational Test and Evaluation report found that the Apache's mission-capable rate during initial operational testing hovered around 53%, meaning roughly half the fleet couldn't fly on any given day. The Cobra, old and limited as it was, posted rates above 75%. Then there was the dust problem. The Apache's twin General Electric T700-GE-701 turboshaft engines ingested air through particle separators designed for European conditions. Temperate, relatively clean air. Desert operations meant fine-grained sand cycling through those engines at concentrations the separators weren't built to handle. During early deployment exercises at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, maintenance crews reported engine erosion rates that would have grounded the fleet within weeks of sustained desert operations. The fix, upgraded particle separators, and more frequent engine inspections added weight, cost, and yet more maintenance hours to an already burdened airframe. Congressional skeptics had a credible case. The helicopter was expensive and fragile in harsh environments, and it demanded a maintenance tail that seemed incompatible with the fast-moving armored warfare it was supposed to support. Representative Denny Smith of Oregon, a former Air Force pilot and persistent Apache critic, argued on the House floor that the Army should buy more A-10 Thunderbolts instead, a fixed-wing aircraft that could carry more ordnance, fly farther, take more punishment, and cost less per unit. The logic was hard to argue with. The Army's counter-argument was harder to articulate in sound bites. The Apache could do something the A-10 couldn't. It could hide behind terrain, pop up, fire, and disappear. It operated from unprepared fields close to the front line, rearmed and refueled from a supply truck. In a 1985 interview with Armed Forces Journal, Major General Ellis D. Parker, who oversaw Army aviation development, put it plainly. The A-10 is a fine airplane, but it can't hide behind a tree. We need to take down 2 radar sites simultaneously, in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, and we need 100% certainty. That was how Colonel Jesse Johnson, commander of Special Operations Command Central, framed the problem to his planning staff in September 1990, according to accounts published in Michael R. Gordon and General Bernard E. Trainor's The General's War. 100% certainty. In military planning, those words are a dare. The conventional playbook doesn't have an answer, so somebody needs to invent one. The problem had crystallized over the summer as CENTCOM intelligence analysts mapped Iraq's Kari air defense network. The French-built system linked radar stations, command nodes, surface-to-air missile batteries, and early warning sites into an integrated web that could coordinate responses across the entire country. Two early warning stations, designated Objective Red and Objective White by coalition planners, sat roughly 35 miles apart in the desert of western Iraq, covering a corridor that coalition strike packages would need to transit in the opening minutes of the air campaign. Destroy them simultaneously, and you punched a hole wide enough to funnel hundreds of aircraft into Iraqi airspace undetected. Miss one, even partially, and the Kari network would reroute data through surviving nodes fast enough to bring the entire southern air defense grid to alert status. Lieutenant General Horner's air campaign plan had no margin for a partial result. The first wave included F-117 stealth fighters heading for Baghdad and F-15E Strike Eagles hitting Scud sites, with EF-111 Ravens running electronic jamming corridors ahead of both. All of them needed that gap clean. The initial plan called for Air Force assets to handle the radar sites. Cruise missiles were considered first, Tomahawks launched from naval vessels in the Red Sea or Persian Gulf. The problem was timing precision. Tomahawk flight times varied with routing, and CENTCOM needed both sites destroyed within the same 60-second window. A Tomahawk arriving 90 seconds late at one site meant Iraqi operators might have time to transmit a warning. F-111Fs with laser-guided bombs were discussed next, but degraded weather over the target area during the projected strike window made that option unreliable. Stealth fighters could handle the mission, but were already allocated to higher priority targets in Baghdad, and there weren't enough to go around. Horner needed something that could loiter near the target, confirm destruction visually, and reattack immediately if any element survived the first volley. Something that could guarantee the result. Cody got the call in October 1990. He was commanding 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and his unit had just completed a rotation at the National Training Center, where Apache readiness rates had for once exceeded expectations. The maintenance problems that plagued earlier deployments had been ground down through sheer institutional stubbornness. Crew chiefs had memorized failure patterns, supply sergeants hoarded critical spare parts, and the whole maintenance culture treated every grounded aircraft as a personal insult. Cody flew to Riyadh and received the mission brief, 40 minutes of planning discussion, then weeks of obsessive preparation. He selected his best 8 aircrews and began rehearsing at a remote airfield near King Fahd, building mock target arrays from oil drums and engineer stakes in the Saudi desert. The crews flew the mission profile repeatedly, at night, at low altitude, with full combat loads, never deviating from the operational parameters. The Pave Low helicopters from the 20th Special Operations Squadron would provide GPS navigation to the initial point, since the Apaches lacked precision GPS receivers. After that, the Apaches would push ahead, alone. The rehearsals revealed a timing problem. The 2 target sites needed to die simultaneously, but they sat far enough apart that a single flight of Apaches couldn't engage both. Cody split his force into 2 teams of 4, Red Team under his personal command, heading for the western site, White Team under Captain Newman Grubb, taking the eastern one. Synchronization came down to a countdown. Both teams would reach their firing positions at a predetermined time, and Cody would initiate a radio call, 30 seconds, that served as the only coordination between the 2 elements across 35 miles of dark desert. The whole execution window from first Hellfire launch to confirmed destruction was calculated at under 5 minutes. Between runs, refueling trucks kept the birds turning while crews reviewed their timing marks under chemical light sticks. Cody drove his crews through the profile until the timing was automatic. The most complex air campaign in history started with a radio call that lasted 2 seconds. Cody's voice broke squelch at 0237 hours local time. Party in 10. Both teams acknowledged with mic clicks, no words, just brief static pops across the frequency. The Pave Lows had already done their job, leading the formation across the border and dropping chemical light bundles at the pre-planned coordinates where the Apaches would split into their separate attack axes. The big MH-53Js peeled off and turned south. From this point forward, 8 Apache crews were alone in Iraqi airspace with nothing but their FLIR screens and a countdown running in their heads. Red Team covered the final 12 miles to Objective Red at 120 knots, holding 50 feet above the hardpan. Cody's co-pilot gunner, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Tip O'Neill, had the TADS turret slaved forward, scanning for the radar site. At 6 miles out, the installation resolved on the FLIR display. Buildings, antenna arrays, a generator compound, vehicles parked in neat rows. O'Neill began lacing targets and assigning them across the flight. 35 miles east, White Team was doing the same thing. Captain Grubb's 4 Apaches had picked up Objective White on their sensors and were running through identical procedures, matching the timeline to the second. 2 groups of helicopters separated by the width of a small country, unable to see each other, coordinating a simultaneous attack based on a rehearsal schedule and 1 2-word radio call. Party in 30. Cody's final timing call. Then the desert lit up. At 02:38, both teams opened fire simultaneously. The Hellfires came off the rails in rapid sequence, 27 missiles total across both objectives, followed by bursts of Hydra, 70 rockets, and long hammering passes from the M2-30 chain guns. Cody later described the scene to Army Aviation magazine as, like the 4th of July. The FLIR footage, portions of which were eventually declassified, showed buildings detonating from the inside out as Hellfires punched through walls and roofs before their shaped charge warheads fired. Secondary explosions cascaded through the generator compounds, and antenna arrays folded and collapsed under the barrage. At Objective White, Grubb's team put Hellfires into every structure large enough to house electronic equipment, then raked the debris with 30mm cannon fire to ensure nothing survived that could transmit. 4.5 minutes after the first missile launch, Cody transmitted the code word confirming total destruction of both sites. Hundreds of coalition aircrew monitoring the frequency now knew the corridor was open. F-117S were already crossing into Iraqi airspace. The Apache, the helicopter Congress nearly killed, the airframe that couldn't stay out of the maintenance bay, fired the opening shots of a war. Every single aircraft in that first wave made it through the gap without taking a round of radar-guided fire. Did Task Force Normandy prove the Apache could fight, or did it prove 8 hand-picked crews flying a rehearsed mission against fixed targets could fight? The rest of Desert Storm answered that. Over 42 days of combat operations, 274 Apaches flew more than 2,600 sorties across the Kuwaiti theater of operations. They destroyed over 500 Iraqi armored vehicles, tanks, APCs, artillery pieces, radar vans, bunkers. During the Ground War's 100-hour sprint, Apache battalions from the 101st Airborne and 1st Armored Division operated around the clock in conditions that would have grounded them 2 years earlier. Sand, still 8 engines. TADS turrets drifted out of alignment on the same schedule they always had. Maintenance crews worked 20-hour shifts under tarps stretched between helicopters, same as stateside. But mission-capable rates during the war held between 85 and 90%, numbers that would have seemed delusional to the GAO analysts who wrote those withering reports in the mid-1980s. The difference wasn't a redesigned helicopter. The airframe was essentially unchanged. What changed was the institutional knowledge wrapped around it. Hundreds of crew chiefs who had spent years learning exactly how to keep the machine alive in conditions it was never designed for. The Apache came home from Desert Storm validated. Congress stopped trying to kill the program. Production continued. The helicopter deployed to the Balkans, to Somalia, to every contingency operation the Army touched through the 1990s. And then came March 24, 2003. The engagement near Karbala was one of the worst miscalculations of the entire war. 33 Apaches from the 11th Aviation Regiment launched a deep attack against the Medina Division of the Republican Guard, Iraq's best-equipped armored formation, dug in along a corridor south of Baghdad. The mission profile called for the Apaches to fly roughly 80 miles ahead of friendly ground forces, locate Iraqi armor concentrations, and destroy them before the 3rd Infantry Division's advance reached the engagement area. Deep attack. The Army had trained for it throughout the 1990s. On paper, it leveraged everything the Apache did well: night operations, standoff missile engagement, rapid target servicing, freedom to reposition between firing runs. What happened instead was an ambush. Iraqi commanders had positioned observers along the anticipated approach routes. When the Apache formation crossed into the engagement zone, the lights in several small towns along the Euphrates River Valley went dark simultaneously, a prearranged signal. Within seconds, every rooftop, berm, and irrigation ditch in the area erupted with small arms fire, RPGs, and anti-aircraft artillery. The Apaches flew into a wall of tracers at low altitude. Chief Warrant Officer 2 David Williams and Chief Warrant Officer 2 Ronald Young, Jr., flying an Apache from the 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment, took an RPG hit that severed hydraulic lines and forced them down in an agricultural field. They were captured and held as POWs for 22 days. Their helicopter, serial number 99-5135, was the only Apache lost that night. 31 of the remaining 32 Apaches took battle damage. Some absorbed dozens of hits from small arms and machine gun fire. Rotor blades were perforated, fuel cells were punctured, and self-sealed, exactly as designed. Transmission housings caught rounds that would have destroyed lighter airframes. Every single one of those 31 damaged helicopters made it back to base. Robert H. Scales, writing in The Iraq War, a military history, noted that the Karbala engagement demonstrated both the vulnerability of attack helicopters to prepared defenses and the extraordinary resilience of the AH-64 airframe. The helicopter, that critics called too fragile for combat, absorbed punishment that bordered on absurd and kept flying. Some of those airframes were repaired and back on the flight line within 48 hours. The irony was hard to miss. The Apache's most convincing proof of survivability came from a mission that was, by every operational measure, a failure. The helicopter that couldn't stay mission-ready ended up outselling every attack platform on the market. Boeing's production line in Mesa, Arizona, has delivered more than 2,400 AH-64s since the first airframe rolled off in 1983. 17 nations fly the Apache today: the United Kingdom, Israel, Egypt, Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, Greece, India, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Indonesia, among others. The export list reads like a catalog of countries that could afford to buy anything on the market and chose this. The helicopter that couldn't maintain a 50% readiness rate during its first field exercises at Fort Hood now anchors the attack aviation doctrine of half the Western Alliance. Some of those export customers paid upward of $35 million per airframe for the AH-64 Guardian variant, the latest production model, which entered service in 2011. They paid it willingly. Several came back and ordered more. The Longbow variant changed the calculus entirely. When the AH-64D entered service in the late 1990s, carrying the AN/AP G78 fire control radar in a dome mounted above the main rotor, it gave crews the ability to detect, classify, and prioritize up to 128 targets simultaneously. Then engage the top 16 in under 30 seconds without ever exposing the airframe above a tree line. During operational testing, Longbow-equipped Apaches achieved a 28-to-1 exchange ratio against simulated armored formations. The radar dome added weight, cost, and, naturally, another subsystem that needed maintenance. Nobody in the program was surprised by that last part. Israel has used its Apaches, designated Seraph, in continuous combat operations for decades. The British Army flew theirs off the deck of HMS Ocean during the 2011 Libya intervention, the first time Apaches had ever operated from a naval vessel in combat. The Netherlands deployed its fleet to Afghanistan, where Dutch crews flew close air support missions in Uruzgan province under conditions that mirrored the worst of the American desert experience. All of them discovered what the U.S. Army discovered in the 1980s. the helicopter demands more from its maintenance crews than any rotary wing platform in existence. None of them stopped flying it. The AH-64 Guardian model currently in production can control unmanned aerial vehicles from the cockpit and data link targeting information to other aircraft in real time. It engages targets with a new generation of joint air-to-ground missiles that make the original Hellfire look like a science project. The Army's current plan keeps the Apache in service past 2040. Over 60 years of operational life, if that timeline holds. The Senate Appropriations Committee nearly strangled this program in its crib. 60 years of operational life is one way to answer that. Cody retired as a 4-star general, Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. The 8 crews from Task Force Normandy scattered across careers. A few stayed in aviation, most eventually left the service. The sand in western Iraq still covers what's left of objectives red and white. At 0238 on January 17, 1991, the rotors were beating at 289 cycles per minute, and the sand came up to meet them in a wall of brown-white nothing. The Apaches flew through it,